I'm so excited to now hand over to Dr. Anthony McGee, who has stepped in when we were all a little bit shell-shocked when Michelle finally, actually, despite warning us that she was transitioning for months, when she did finally take that step. And it has been such a joy over the last few months to get to know Anthony a bit better. And his combination of such rigor and such incredible disciplinary knowledge as a scientist, but also his absolutely humanizing presence and the way in which he's kind of embraced the NSCF community, and he's stepped into this role as our acting lead. It has been really such a blessing. So Anthony, very, very warm welcome to you, and we are so grateful for you and for the role that you are playing. Anthony is going to lead us into a bit of a deeper conversation around what makes up the phase 4 of the work of the NSCF. And then he's going to hand over to Fatima. Anthony will also just briefly introduce Fatima, who will then take this phase 4 of our work and just put it in the sort of context also of the G20 and the GBIF meetings that are happening. And then after Anthony and Fatima has shared with us, we will then introduce Simon, who will then take us even one step out to share with us the larger context within which we are doing our work. So, colleagues, if you want to imagine the rings on a tree trunk, if you want to imagine those rings sort of moving out, where we are, we've just had a reminder of our mission, our values, our purpose. We're going to place that in the immediate context of the work of the NSCF now for phase 4. We're going to place that in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the G20, and then we're going to place it in the larger context of the environmental crisis that we find ourselves in. So I hope you really enjoy the next hour or so of us reflecting on what is the bigger picture within which we are doing our work and what are we called upon to do now. So over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Ilse. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the forum. I'm glad to be here today, to be on the opposite side, I guess, of this journey. So yeah, I'm happy to talk us through today, as Ilse said, around phase 4 of NSCF work and really how we fall into the Global Biodiversity Framework. Ilse, you've introduced that really well. So why do collections matter? And I know we're all familiar with this. We know that collections hold more than specimens. They're long-term data sets that underpin the effective biodiversity science. They're essential for tracking change over time, identifying species declines, and informing restoration. Next slide. As a community, as we saw in the video earlier, we've made significant progress towards ensuring that our collections are effectively safeguarded and cared for. Where possible, we've invested in upgrading collections infrastructure. We've developed and published the collections manual, which guides our work according to best practice. And we've used this document as the basis to providing training and focused interventions over recent years. Next slide. Most recently, we embarked on a process of facilitated self-assessment to reflect on our progress and the impact of the interventions we've done so far. These assessments have given us a snapshot of the state of collections now, both for individual institutions and for the network as a whole. And we can use this as a guiding document to track our progress going forward. Next slide. So as a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, South Africa is committed to implementing the Global Biodiversity Framework through its National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. The GBIF sets out an ambitious agenda for protecting biodiversity with 20 3 targets and 4 goals. And it hinges on strong data and scientific infrastructure. Next slide. And so I was asked to kind of look at how could or are science collections contributing and supporting the targets for this framework. And so we'll just go into that a little bit more. Next slide. And then I'll focus in on some of these. So collections are central to targets around effective monitoring. So you can see in terms of those 3 targets on spatial planning, restoration, protected areas, there's clear links to collections. Next slide. They provide the baseline for conservation with several targets there. Next slide. They have a clear role towards informing sustainable use and health. Next slide. They're integral for ensuring access and benefit sharing. And finally, as the foundation for knowledge sharing capacity development. You can see that science collections are integral for several of the 23 targets of the GBIF. And certainly there may be others that are relevant upon close inquiry. So this is really just a first assessment of where we possibly could work into such a framework. Next slide. So I've just looked at a few of the targets, not specifically all, and certainly not in extensive detail. We obviously would have to populate this more broadly. But if we look at target 1, which focuses on integrated spatial planning for biodiversity collections, or for biodiversity, we know that collections provide the records that feed into species distribution models and ecosystem mapping. A good example is where collections can identify areas of high endemism for protection or use for plans for conservation needs under future climatic scenarios. Next slide. To conserve species effectively, we need to know where they occur, how they're changing, and what threats they face. So specimens provide critical historical baselines, especially for threatened and cryptic taxa. And we know the national species threat assessments rely heavily on collections data. Next slide. Collections can and do contribute to enhancing sustainability for agriculture, aquaculture, fishery, and forestry. Phenotypic variation and distribution data for crop wild relatives preserved in collections is an important tool for informing biodiversity, informing breeding programs. And so a good example is obviously crop wild relatives programs. Next slide. Specimens are essential for understanding zoonotic spillover. They help map pathogen reservoirs and inform disease preparedness, which align with GBIF goals on biodiversity and health. And next slide. They're also central to discussions around benefit sharing. They house the physical vouchers tied to genetic resources and can support tracking and attribution of traditional knowledge. In particular, I'm referring to, in this example, the National Indigenous Knowledge Management System run by the DSI. Next slide. Then, as we know, target 20, which is the need for open access to biodiversity data collections, of course, feed heavily into this. And this is something that Fatima will touch on in the next presentation. Next slide. And then finally, capacity building. Collections are essential infrastructure tools for inspiring new appreciation for the natural world. We do this through exhibitions and outreach activities, but they're also an important tool for training and developing future generations of taxonomists, ecologists, and collection technicians. Next slide. The GBIF also makes clear the need for FAIR principles, which is a principle around data. And so FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And when it comes to that, vouchering, a core function that we already are doing, and a core function of collections, is an important component to achieving this. When research is based on physical vouchers, it's possible to revisit, sorry, my computer's turned off, to revisit and verify findings. And so it's critical for scientific integrity. Next slide. So to build robust policy relevant science, we must advocate for and continue supporting specimen-based research and ensure that we have long-term preservation of these scientific vouchers. This extends to ecological, medicinal, and evolutionary studies. Next slide. So in this next phase of the NSCF, the aim is to build on the work that we've done as a community in securing science collections, but with a focus to reveal the socioeconomic value of these collections by increasing their use and broadening their application. Caring for collections will remain at the center of our work, because in order to deliver these fruits, we need to harness the full potential of our diverse, scientifically rigorous collections. Next slide. To do this, we will build on the significant progress we've made with capturing our collections data sets. 68%, the majority of our collections, have more than 75% of their specimens captured. In this next phase, we'll be on expanding the specimen data sets by exploring automation for transcribing label data, upgrading the specimen data to ensure it meets publication standards. But you can also see that the majority of our data sets are currently not published onto global aggregators like GBIF, and so largely unavailable to support national priorities. And so we aim to develop capacity and support institutions to publish these data sets going forward. Next slide. We also aim to launch the virtual museum, and I know that's a long-awaited milestone that we all are anxious to get off the ground. In the previous phase, we developed standardization protocols for imaging and focused on imaging the holdings of herbaria and specifically vertebrate type specimens. But in this next phase, we need to exponentially increase the rate at which we are imaging by exploring mass digitization technologies. Next slide. I think just wanted to put into context some global work of similar initiatives. And so DISCO is the distributed system of scientific collections based in the European Union. And I think it's a largely comparable infrastructure, very similar work to the work that we're doing in the NSCF. It's pan-European, and it aims to digitally unify access to over 1 billion specimens held in natural science collections across Europe. Next slide. And so what I've done is summarize really the main key priorities of DISCO in the next few years. And I think what I really want to highlight here is just that their focus is on coordination, shared platforms, high throughput digitization, and publication of high quality scientific data. And I think this aligns really closely with the work we're doing and shows that our focus going forward really does align with ensuring long-term impact and integration into policy. Next slide. And then just to put some of the socioeconomic potential of the work we're doing into context, I've just highlighted 2 recent studies. The first is a study commissioned by the Australian Academy for Science, which looks at their work around Mission Taxonomy Australia. And you can see here that they've determined or predicted a benefit of 4 to 32 times return on investment for this program, which aims to describe all species of Australia in this generation. And then a similar study by the Natural History Museum, which looks at the benefits of digitizing UK collections for the United Kingdom benefit. And they similarly found a 10 times return on investment for such an activity in terms of socioeconomic value. Next slide. And so just to summarize, collections are important biodiversity infrastructure. They certainly are vital for tracking progress on several of important policy targets and global goals. And that I think by aligning collections with natural biodiversity priorities and framing them using these policy frameworks, we can increase national recognition for collections as strategic research infrastructure, and we can position collections for increased use and impact as foundations for resilient ecosystems. Thank you. Then I'll introduce Dr. Fatima Parker Ali. Fatima is the lead for the SA GBIF node and the Deputy Director for Biodiversity Informatics at SAMBI. And so we've asked Fatima to introduce to us really the role of the GBIF node for South African data landscape, and to talk a little bit around, and we'll explore this a little bit later in the next session around the G20. Fatima?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much, Anthony, for that introduction. So I'm Fatima Parker Ali. I'm the SANBI GBIF Node Manager and also the Deputy Director for Biodiversity Informatics. And as Anthony mentioned, I'm going to be speaking to you about the SANBI GBIF node and basically, how the NSCF then is positioned within that. So as a as a part of the biodiversity stakeholder landscape, I'm basically the NSCF will be included in what we'll be discussing, and basically is definitely part of the SANBI GBIF landscape. So I'm going to be talking to you about the data revolution, the SANBI and the biodiversity informatics landscape, GBIF. We'll do an overview of the SANBI GBIF strategic objectives. I'm going to touch on the GBIF Graduate Researchers Award as an opportunity, and then we'll talk about the G20 efforts. So the past 2 decades has seen a significant advancement of new technologies and techniques such as mass digitization, the Internet of Things, next generation sequencing, which has basically led to an exponential increase in the volumes and types of data, resulting in a data deluge. This huge increase in the volumes and types of data has created unprecedented possibilities for society and the conservation of nature and decision-making. So if we look at this data deluge, the ability to leverage the data revolution for biodiversity conservation and sustainable development is critical. Our ability to use high-quality data across the data value chain for monitoring, to develop assessments, for modeling biodiversity scenarios, and being able to effect change would make the application of biodiversity informatics tools and techniques very relevant. In a world that counts, the United Nations describe data as the lifeblood of decision-making and the raw materials for accountability. So good and accurate data are key building blocks for analysis in support of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, including the management of our biodiversity and ecological infrastructure. To those of you that are not familiar with this publication, it's really an excellent read, so I would encourage you to have a look at that. So SANBI as a biodiversity informatics institution, SANBI itself has a strong mandate to collect, generate, coordinate, and disseminate biodiversity and maintain databases. So as a knowledge-based organization, biodiversity information is a key resource that drives research and innovation. It informs planning, policy, and decision-making. So it's therefore critical that we manage our biodiversity information as a strategic asset that leverages shared value to South Africa in support of sustainable decisions, and also to support our broader developmental agendas. So key to this is a strong regional agenda aligned to the National Development Plan, creating a better South Africa, a better Africa, and a better world. So we've also, as an institution, we support several international initiatives, including GBIF, also IPBES, and we've also managed to leverage this membership to GBIF to meet our outcomes in terms of our biodiversity-driven mandate under NEMBA. And so with such a data-intensive function, developing capacity in biodiversity informatics skills is quite critical. To some of you that knows SANBI, we work across the value chain, and also if you're not familiar, we basically work across a value chain looking at the foundations of biodiversity, where we mobilize biodiversity specimens, we hold collections, we generate information towards the next tier, which looks at assessing biodiversity, looking at monitoring and then towards policy and decision making, but ultimately that this information, as it moves up the value chain, is useful for human well-being, for job creation, and so forth. We also manage biodiversity information across that value chain through these different divisions, as well as managing the zoos and the gardens. So as we've mentioned, we see the organization as a biodiversity informatics institution, and of course we work with many partners. One of them, GBIF, was established in 2001 as a mega science initiative through the OECD, and it's an intergovernmental organization composed of many nodes and international organizations. So this research infrastructure has become an enabler for the data science policy value chain, which supports effective decision-making outcomes. So its main aim has been to mobilize and put to use vast amount of biodiversity information, thereby supporting scientific research, agriculture, all kinds of thematic areas, health, education, conservation, basically serving the economic and quality of life interests of society. So in the South African context, and especially in terms of the South African Science, Technology and Innovation White Paper, South Africa has become a member of GBIF to strengthen its efforts in open access philosophies and to drive towards a knowledge economy. We've heard earlier that Chanel also spoke about open science and open access, and so GBIF essentially ties into those philosophies. And so here, data basically forms the basis for innovation. Economic growth is driven by innovation, and the key driver for innovation is high-end human capital. So the development of capacity in biodiversity informatics supporting open science has also become a key focus area for the SANBI GBIF node. Just a little bit of context about the structure of GBIF. GBIF is an intergovernmental initiative whose members are known as participants, and these are the countries or international organizations. And basically countries, organizations would sign an MOU with GBIF and basically would collaborate in advancing free and open access to biodiversity data. So under this MOU, each participant would then establish a node, which basically coordinates GBIF-related activities within a given country or organization, often including the management of its own network of data sharing institutions or publishers. And so SANBI, South Africa, basically signed an MOU in 2003. I'm not going to go into the detail of all of this, but just to say there are a number of committees, there are decisions that's made within these committees. We have on an annual basis a governing board which makes decisions and which South Africa is certainly a part of. We are a voting participant, which means we pay membership dues also to contribute to the decision-making of this global body. And so this is quite an important concept also, that we make decisions, especially around our biodiversity information at the governing board. So there are a number of, there's an executive committee also that supports this work. There's a number of standing committees, a science committee, budget committee, and then the participant node managers committee, as well as some task forces. Some useful metrics. Currently, there's over 3 million biodiversity occurrence records accessible through GBIF. Not only is the information accessible, but it's also used. We see here that there are over 12,000 peer-reviewed papers that are using the data that's mediated through GBIF. A number of hosted portals also that's been developed, and over 100,000 data sets that's been published. And I've mentioned also that we have approximately, well, here we have approximately 64 countries and about 40 organizational participants that forms part of the network. As a country, we have a number of strategic objectives, which is to grow human capital in biodiversity informatics. So these are the objectives of the node. We also we aim to grow our national network through partnerships and data mobilization, through advising on strategic, international, and regional initiatives, and then also promoting the use, the mobilization, and application of data, especially as it relates to science, technology, and innovation. We are guided by a number of strategic frameworks. To those of you that have not looked at the Global Biodiversity Information Outlook, this is also another very relevant publication which provides us a vision, an overarching vision for biodiversity informatics. And there's a lot of detail in there, which I'm not going to go into, but just to say that it's very useful and relevant, looking at data standards, monitoring, and our information of the value chain. We are guided by a strategic framework. Currently, we are in the 2023-27 phase, and this also changes on a 5-year basis. And then we are also guided by SANBI's strategic framework. So there are a number of alignments that we do make and we ensure. Currently, as a country, we have mobilized more than 38 million biodiversity records, and we certainly don't do that on our own. The NSCF is an important component to this. We have many partners across the country also that contribute to enabling this 38 million records that are published. And we also have a hosted portal. We were part of the pilot phase of GBIF that was involved in the development of this hosted portal, which also serves many biodiversity images. So what is this data that we are serving? Basically, the primary biodiversity data, looking at, it's basically a window of evidence about where species live and when. So primary data basically being the what of what the species is, where it's found, when it was found, what is the evidence, and there might be additional information such as abundance, sequencing information, and so on. So basically the specimen information, sequences, citizen science observation records, literature, or tracking data. And so here we also have an indication of occurrences across the globe. And we are then able to make this information accessible by using biodiversity data standards. And in this instance, we are talking about the Darwin Core Standard that enables us to mobilize and publish this data from many organizations across the country through GBIF. As I've mentioned, we do this through the Integrated Publishing Toolkit. And one of our more recent publishers includes Sandparks and the Freshwater Research Center, who we also support through hosting on the IPT. We've also been implemented a mass digitization initiative at the Pretoria Herbarium, and this basically has enabled us to accelerate the speed of digitization by orders of magnitude. And so this is basically an industrial scale digitization of images through a conveyor belt. And this has also been an initiative we also supported through GBIF, or at least facilitated through GBIF at a point where we visited the Helsinki Museum in 2017, which was part of a GBIF governing board site visit. And this has basically been so inspiring that we were able to implement this in South Africa. So just taking this data mobilization work forward, we've now spoken about the IPT and mobilizing data through our network of partners and SANBI as well. We've looked at mass digitization, but we also have an initiative, the Foundational Biodiversity Program, which also publishes data through the SANBI GBIF IPT, and that is also a requirement of the program. And there's also investment from DSTI towards the FBIP program. So in this slide, I'm going to go quickly through this, but here we're basically looking at the bottom layer, looking at our source data, which could be images, specimens, observations, sequences, which is mobilized through our communities, whether it's the FBIP, the NSCF, whether it's our naturalists, that then contributes to global data sets such as GBIF or the International Barcode of Life, or BHL, which is the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is then also relevant for scientific research, for expert assessments, supporting science policies such as IPBES, but ultimately this information needs to be useful and relevant at national government level. So it needs to be supporting the policies that we are developing, and then also this then also feeds into our government's obligations towards aspects such as the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the Sustainable Development Goals. And you've heard Anthony also speak quite a bit to those goals earlier. So if we look at what happens to our information, we're basically looking at whether it's our species data from our collections, or it's genetic data or ecosystems. This information basically plugs into a number of assessments or other products. But for SANBI also, one of the key ones is the National Biodiversity Assessment, and also once again, including many of our stakeholders' data that is then used in these assessments, also for natural capital accounting, ultimately towards efforts such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, enabling us to then plan and prioritize, to make decisions to support various initiatives and decision making. As a node, we've been involved in many initiatives in terms of biodiversity informatics. We've basically looked at curriculum development, and we've done this at the global level. So being part of GBIF has enabled us to look at curriculum development for biodiversity informatics through our network of nodes. And we've been able to take that work that we've done and also look at this at the national level. And we've looked at a conceptual approach here as well to developing biodiversity informatics in South Africa. And a number of our NSCF partners were also involved at a point at the Biodiversity Information Management Forum as well, where we've elaborated some of that work. We've implemented an e-learning initiative as well, where we've basically been supported by GBIF Spain, which hosts an e-learning platform that we then, where we also support the community in terms of the content that's made available. So here, basically, to improve data quality and to enhance use and uptake, we look at capacity development opportunities, and we've been doing that since around 2008. And that information is available. And we've had many different training opportunities, and we continuously have other opportunities that our network of partners has access to. We've also been involved in a number of partnerships, which has culminated in also training, in data mobilization, in capacity development more broadly as well, and also supporting some of our e-learning work. Our work with GBIF Norway has also looked at advancing DNA barcoding, looking at data publishing of molecular information, and that's also an ongoing piece of work, and also aligned to a current thematic area within GBIF, also looking at molecular publishing. I've mentioned at the outset that I'll speak about the GBIF Young Researchers Award, and this is just a quick introduction to this award, primarily because we also want people to connect a bit more with this. It's a wonderful opportunity for masters and PhD students with an award of 5,000 Rand, euros, which basically looks at innovative research and discovery in biodiversity informatics. So basically using the data and advancing informatics. So at the national level, we have a panel that supports this work. And the further opportunity is also the Ebby Nielsen Challenge, which is recognizing innovative tools dealing also with biodiversity informatics areas, and a larger award in relation to that. So this takes us, after talking about the efforts of the node, we've also been involved in efforts around the G20. And so the G20 is basically an intergovernmental forum consisting of about 19 countries, including the European Union and the African Union. And basically, this initiative, it works to address major issues related to the global economy, such as international financial stability, climate change mitigation, and sustainable development. And so South Africa came on board also as supporting GBIF, following the Brazilian presidency that included GBIF as a knowledge partner. And so last year, basically, GBIF had looked at a number of areas, but under the priority open innovation for a sustainable Amazon. And so here, two key areas that we looked at gaining support from countries was to expand data mobilization and human capacity development for policy-relevant biodiversity data. Here, GBIF has been involved in an initiative called the Biodiversity Information for Development Programs, which supports megadiverse countries. And so it looked at gaining endorsement from the G20 for further work to support developing countries, and also updating the inventories of the world's herbaria and natural history museums. And so this is looking at enhancing efforts around the global scientific registry for collections. So as I've mentioned, the South African delegation to G20 supported GBIF as a knowledge partner, and it was decided to take this work through to 2025, where South Africa is hosting the G20. And so importantly, what this affords us is the opportunity to gain support from, about 19 to 20 countries, from the EU, from the AU, to endorse various efforts that we put on the table. And this will then include, in last year, we raised issues around, we raised aspects around open science and open data, but included within that were aspects of indigenous knowledge. And here, as South Africa, we managed to also include the FAIR principles into the CARE principles, which is basically that indigenous communities have collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics, all considered as part of the work that we are doing in terms of biodiversity data. And this was then included in the ministerial declaration. And so in the later session, we'll talk a bit more about the G20, and you will see how that would be relevant to the deliverables that we are looking at going forward. So the work of the node, basically, we are part of the Research and Innovation Working Group. And for 2025, then we've identified an area following through from the Brazilian presidency and the work that was done there to look at biodiversity information for sustainable development. And we know for the African continent, this is really critical for us, these issues around sustainable development. And so based on the work that we've been doing as part of GBIF, the work that's been key within the GBIF Global for that matter, and then also for the country and for Africa, we've looked at 3 deliverables, which we'll expand on later, but this is just to introduce this. It's basically that so we've looked at 3 priority areas. Basically that the G20 endorses the GBIF network expansion through the 18 regional or sub-regional technical and scientific cooperation centers as selected by the CBD. So to those of you that might not be aware, SANBI has been elected to host a regional or sub-regional, as they are calling it, technical and scientific cooperation center for the CBD. So basically here we've looked at GBIF network expansion and support for the CBD centers, looking at also capacity building for species cataloging being added to their work program. But for this community also importantly, we've looked at that the G20 supports a seminar which includes the invitation of National Museum representatives, which highlights museums and other scientific collections collaboration to equitably reduce the capacity and knowledge asymmetry. So that deliverable, it sounds like a mouthful, but what we are talking about here is that many of you will be aware that there are asymmetries between the global north and the global south, basically between developing countries and developed countries, that there are large amounts of our biodiversity specimens that may reside in the museums of the North, while the biodiversity resides in the South, and lots of skills and capacity also that exists in the North. And so here we are talking about how do we go about collaborating to equitably reduce the capacity and knowledge asymmetries, right? So that's a key area that we are looking at for the museums community. And the last one then is that the G20 endorses the development of a catalogue of life, which is a list of all the world species. So we'll expand on that, but this is quite an interesting and exciting area of work where we are hoping to develop, in the case of the museums community, a roadmap, but also that we wanted to connect with this community to look at how we can raise priorities and how we can look at improving collaboration and supporting the community better. So with that, I thank you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Fatima. Sure, that was quite a journey, and a lot of information and a lot of exciting developments. And really, it's got that feeling of where we are located, each of us in our little collection, and how the ripples that ripple out in terms of the larger project that we're all part of and the larger community that we belong to. So thank you so much, and thank you for all your work in holding that node, leadership in that node, and we look forward to continuing the conversation a little bit later this morning, towards the end of this morning. And we hope that you enjoy your time here with the NSCF community. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ilse.
So colleagues, we are going to give you one more presentation. I'm sure you are already feeling that there has been you are already processing quite a lot of information that has come from Anthony and that has come from Fatima. But there is one more piece that's really important, which is the largest context that we find ourselves in. Why are we engaging in any way with all this biodiversity informatics, with all this information? You know, what is the biggest why of all? And for that, I'm going to hand over to Simon. So I'm sure Simon is familiar to many of you. He's the curator of entomology at the Iziko Museum. He is it seems to me, Simon, that you're probably the world expert on fig wasps, given all the articles that has been published. Simon he says that he's a field biologist. He's done research expeditions across Africa, and his main passion, he says, which I love this, it seems so mysterious, is the discovery and documentation of the wealth of unknown insect diversity that is still out there. And yeah, that created in me a new sense of wonder again for the work that you all do. So thank you so much for joining us, Simon, and over to you. And colleagues, once Simon is done, we're going to be breaking into breakaway groups to give you an opportunity to just process all of what you've heard this morning from our opening speakers. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Ilse. And yeah, both Anthony and Fatima have already excellently provided an excellent overview of most of the points that I'm going to make here this morning. But there's no harm in repeating and reiterating why natural history collections are so important and why they have such high value in assessing the impact of global change. Yeah, so in terms of climate crisis, but more appropriately, it's actually the biodiversity crisis as a result of global climate change. So what is global change? In terms of the biodiversity crisis specifically, discovery and description of unknown species, as we all know, is proceeding woefully slowly and is outcompeted by species extinction. And extinction is our fault, largely. It's because of historical pesticide use, climate change, atmospheric nitrification from the burning of fossil fuels, invasive species and habitat transformation, both transformation, degradation, and destruction. And degradation, habitat degradation is just as bad as this complete destruction. Small amounts of degradation also results in huge numbers of species loss. So loss of biodiversity and the associated ecosystem will result in a major decline in the world's economic value. And this has adverse effects on the sustainable use of our planet's resources. So the current escalated rate of biomass reduction and species loss is alarming. Particularly given the critical ecological roles such as pollination, predation, herbivory, recycling of nutrients, and as a food resource for a plethora of other organisms. So in summary, species extinctions are due to a multitude of anthropogenic inductions driven by unsustainable human population growth. We cannot deny that, placing us in a period of dramatic global change. So collections play a pivotal role in the assessment and mitigation of anthropogenically driven reductions in our biodiversity. Collections are fundamental for educating the public, the policymakers, and conservationists about the value of biodiversity. They are fundamental resources for training future generations of scientists and collection managers and technicians for that matter. They are fundamental in providing data for informing environmental impact assessments and for providing baseline data for assessing rate of global change and biodiversity loss. So natural history collections house billions of specimens. There's an estimated number of 3 billion. And taxonomy is central to interpreting the global biodiversity crisis. We all know what taxonomy is. And the process of species discovery, assessment, and description is inherently contingent on natural history collection resources. So these collections often preserve multiple specimens of each species, which provide a broad spatial temporal data set. And this helps with assessing both space variation in terms of geographical distribution and also temporal time variations. In other words, changes in distribution due to changing landscapes or habitats because of impacts or climate change over time. So collections are a window into the past. They contain hundreds of years of accumulated specimens. And this resource is a goldmine of genetic data as well. And collections house knowledge of biodiversity prior to the impact of our impact on habitat destruction and climate change, and hence are fundamental and integral to informing the discipline of conservation biology and for assessing the impact of global change. They not only preserve representatives of living species, but also of extinct species, unfortunately, and these then provide invaluable access back in time. And it's really important to have well-preserved biological entities. We need to look after our collections. We need to conserve them, because these include specimens of extinct species, which can provide us with knowledge, both at the morphological and molecular levels, which we would not have retrieval access to otherwise. They provide baseline data for assessment of population level genetics, species delimitation, and historical evolution of taxon units. This is all critical underlying data that is necessary to inform conservation management decisions. And for many groups, particularly the hyperdiverse invertebrates, we are unfortunately lagging way behind in compiling foundational biodiversity data. For the more flashy groups, the vertebrates and plants, we're in a much better position, but the inverts, we are really, really lagging. So natural history collections are crucial for preserving the data that we have already accumulated over time. There are some re-underlying points again here. They're essential repositories of temporal data. These are necessary to assess long-term changes in distributions, phenology, morphological traits, and genetic variation. They preserve time series of species, and this enables assessment of population structure change, useful in both molecular ecology and conservation biology. However, natural history collections need to be dynamic. We can't sit on our laurels and laud these amazing resources that we have already accumulated over the last 150, 200 years. We need to make sure that they continually grow. And this process needs to be driven by ongoing continuous inventory surveys, because our fauna is rapidly disappearing and our ecosystems are being destroyed. So the curation of collected specimens will ensure expansion of a resource that will continue to increase in value. It's got to be dynamic, and this will provide baseline data essential for informing our future sustainability decisions. So with rapidly increasing rates of human-induced environmental destruction and habitat transformation due to climate change, implementation of ongoing initiatives to survey our diverse ecosystems is a matter of priority. But unfortunately, we are really, really lagging, particularly in the case of the invertebrates, because most African vegetation types are undersampled, and there are massive gaps where we haven't surveyed the species that exist in those places. But the resulting samples, which will be safeguarded in South African Museum and Herbaria collections, are necessary to provide essential baseline data for assessing rates of spatial as well as temporal change in our faunal and floral species richness and abundance. So we need to implement rigorous, quantified, continuous inventory surveys to sample the biodiversity that's still out there. So given that we currently have very limited baseline data on South Africa's organismal species richness available to assess the local extent of the biodiversity crisis that the globe is experiencing, our natural history collections are a major resource that contain a goldmine of data that, when mobilized, will inform rates of decline in our biodiversity. There's no doubt that in South Africa we are rapidly losing much of our biodiversity heritage, but unfortunately we have no idea of the rate that this is happening at. But with leverage of appropriate resources to mobilize the data conserved in our collections and via research conducted by local and world taxonomic specialists, we will be in a far better position to make these critical assessments. We all know we are losing species to extinction faster than we can discover and describe them. Pedro Cardoso in 2011, he provided an overview of 7 impediments to biodiversity conservation. And all of these are dependent on taxonomy and museum resources to mitigate their negative impacts. So firstly, species and the ecosystem service value are largely unknown to the general public. We can't convince people to conserve and protect organisms that they know nothing about. Policymakers and stakeholders are unaware of the issues surrounding invertebrate conservation. Again, that holds again. Education is paramount. Scientific research on invertebrates is limited and underfunded. We all know that. The majority of species are undescribed. Distributions of the known described species are largely unknown. Species abundance and their turnover across space and time are unknown. And biology of species and their vulnerability to habitat change is also largely unknown. So we've got all these major constraints. And in 2020, Pedro Cardoso published and co-authors published an article called Scientists Warning to Humanity on Insect Extinctions. And I'm going to highlight 3 points in his abstract. We are causing insect extinctions by driving habitat loss, degradation and fragmentation, use of polluting and harmful substances, the spread of invasive species, global climate change, direct overexploitation, and co-extinction of species dependent on other species. Such losses lead to the decline of key ecosystem services on which humanity depends. So we need to invest in research programs that generate local, regional, and global strategies that counter this trend. And I think we are making excellent progress in the NSCF and through the SAMBI initiatives. However, there are major constraints. To curate, we all know to curate specimens is a huge cost involved in this. So we've got a bottleneck sitting here right here at this point of mobilization of data. We know very few species. This is just one order of Hymenoptera, one of insects, the order Hymenoptera. We know about 20,000 species in Africa, but I estimate there's somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 species. We've got a huge number of species still to collect and describe, another huge bottleneck. And this just provides a nice little overview of where we're at. So our current inventory survey effort is that tiny little red circle at the bottom of the diagram. And already we have this massive bottleneck at the mobilization of the data and the specimen curation, whereas we should actually be doing this amount of inventory survey. We've got this massive bottleneck that we haven't participated in yet. And there's ongoing repercussions in terms of doing increased inventory surveys at the data mobilization and systematic stage to feed up through the value chain for the benefit of science and society. So we've got constraints at all these different levels, at the sampling level, at the curation level, at the species description level, the digitization level, the elucidation of their importance in ecosystems, and then the implementation of those benefits up through the value chain for the benefit of science and society. To give you one example of unaccessed resources, this is the samples from my last 33 years of inventory surveys conducted in South Africa. I've done some actual counts of specimens in these samples across a subset and extrapolated the data across sampling effort. And there are over 50 million insects sitting in these jars. Each one of these jars can contain thousands of species. Most of the undiscovered biodiversity lies in the invertebrates, and most of those unknown species are small. They're 2 to 3, 4 millimeters long. So these jars contain thousands of specimens. This is nevertheless a black gold. These samples are black gold. And mobilization of this specimen data will allow for an assessment of our biodiversity in South Africa. We're really only just scratching the surface as to what biodiversity is out there. And then this baseline data will allow for an assessment of the rate of insect decline in South Africa. We know we are losing species, but we don't have the baseline data to be able to enable a comparative assessment as to the rate we are losing them at. So there are benefits, AI that's coming on board, these sort of technological advances, and also remote sensing, just like the Bioscape NASA-driven survey, the acoustic and radar simulation survey of the Cape Flora, and obviously molecular methods. They all have the potential to reduce time and effort in curatorial process. So what do we know? I'm just summarizing now. What do we know about our existing collections? We've got this massive, amazing, rich resource of existing biodiversity data, including many undescribed species that are present in our natural history collections. However, this resource represents only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the actual species that are present in the country, particularly in terms of the hyperdiverse invertebrate groups. So most of the African vegetation types have not been adequately sampled. Obviously, vertebrates and plants are better known. So there's a critical need for ongoing implementation of long-term continuous inventory survey sampling, particularly given the rapid escalation in habitat transformation and global warming. What is required to mitigate the biodiversity crisis? Well, we know we are losing species, but we don't know the rate at which this is happening, simply because we haven't mobilized the wealth of available comparative baseline data locked up in natural history collections. We made excellent progress in this regard, but there's huge resources that haven't yet been mobilized. So collections safeguard huge unsorted samples. And these are massive resources required to mobilize this data to document our rich biodiversity and to assess the rate of biodiversity decline. So we need capacity building. We need to leverage funding and create posts to address data mobilization for both primary specimen acquisition, so sampling, fieldwork, and also for the curatorial process, data mobilization, digitization. And all these lead into the up through the value chain for the benefit of science and society. So what do we as the NSCF community need to do? So the priority is to digitize the collections that have not been digitized to mobilize the available curated data that exists in these collections. And we've made awesomely amazing progress in this regard, but there is still some work to be done. So that's a first priority. We need to upload the existing digitized data into the GBIF SA node, as Fatima has eloquently elucidated. Unfortunately, the available data on GBIF, certainly in terms of the ZECOS data, is 15 years out of date. And ideally, this needs to be refreshed at least on an annual basis. We need to up, because databases get cleaned, taxonomy, the classification gets updated and changed. And it's really, really important, as Fatima has provided an overview, to make this data universally available. So we need to leverage funding and create posts to address the curation of the backlog of unsorted samples and collections. But more importantly, we actually need to get out there and survey. We are losing species to extinction faster than we can describe them, faster than we can collect and document them, due to habitat transformation, degradation, and destruction. So it is now more important than it has ever been to mobilize taxonomic resources and leverage appropriate funding to focus our effort on discovery, description, and documentation of our wealth of unknown species. Thank you very much for listening and your attention.
Wow, thank you, Simon. That was a very, very challenging to listen to, very sobering, and somehow also inspiring at the same time. I don't know quite how to express that it held both those energies in your presentation. I think it is partly your passion and your commitment that really just brings such a positive energy through, despite the really challenging and sobering statistics that you've shared. So thank you so much for being part of our community. Thank you so much for the time and effort you took to present this morning. And thank you for the work that you do in the world. Yeah, we all feel really blessed by that. Thank you so much. So Simon, there is a question for you in the chat, but because we are really sort of running a little bit behind time already, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, just responding to it in the chat. Natasha asked you a question in the chat. And I also want to just acknowledge that there is also a question from Robin for I think around the G20 and around sort of the intergovernmental kind of cooperation. So maybe Fatima and Anthony can also just take note of that question, and if you could bring that back into our session, just our late morning session, that would be wonderful. But for now, colleagues, I think it's time for you to meet each other and to have an opportunity to just process a little bit what has been shared so far by our opening speakers. I want to share with you two slides. One is something called the eco cycle. And then secondly, just the questions for your groups. And then Chanel is going to put you in groups of about 5, and you're going to have until tea time to get to know each other a little bit and to just reflect on this morning's input so far. So we're just offering this as a tool, colleagues. Des and my responsibility is to ensure that we remain a learning community together, that this idea of action, reflection, learning, and then taking us to a next round of action, that is completely embedded in all the work that we do, because this is a natural cycle. Nature reflects these cycles, and as the NSCF, we are not just a collection of natural science collections, but we're also a living system in this network. So this comes from something called the Liberating Structures menu. It's a lovely group of little models and methodologies that one can use. And we just want to orientate you to it. So as you can see, colleagues, it is a never-ending cycle. It is an ongoing process of life. And on the bottom left, it starts maybe with something being birthed into the world, something that we've recently started investing in. It moves slowly to a point of maturity. Then that moves down towards autumn. We are in autumn now, since we celebrated the equinox. So then we move towards what's called creative destruction, where eventually we sort of, something releases, something lets go of, something gets composted, and then we move back up in the circle to in this eco cycle. We move back up to gestating something, to seeding something, to the germ of something taking shape that will inform the next cycle of our work and of our growth. there are two traps in the eco-cycle. And so I want to just point those out to you. So what the authors warn us about is between the time when something is gestated, when something has taken shape as a little seed, and the time where it can actually manifest in the world, where we can actually start working on it, there is what's sometimes referred to as the scarcity trap. Sometimes we don't invest enough energy to get something that is in seed form to actually move into birth so that it can actually do its work in the world. And sometimes when we have invested so much in something and it's reached the stage of maturity, we fall into what's called the rigidity trap. So sometimes it's time for us to let go of something, to shift our energy, to shift our focus, to face something that we need to face. And in order for that cycle of life to continue, in order for us to compost our efforts, in order for it to move again to this new cycle. So we just wanted to offer you the eco-cycle. And if we can move to the next slide, Chanel, in our groups, what we are inviting you to discuss, you can use the groups in whichever way you would like. There's freedom in your space together, but our guidelines for you would be to reflect on what struck you about the inputs from our opening speakers, to share something that particularly touched or moved you, and then in your groups, take another look at the eco-cycle and just see whether all the different themes that have been shared, just see what comes up for you. What might be in gestation mode that now really needs an investment from us? And what might have already reached maturity where we might have to think about how we shift our attentions and how we maybe face certain things and let certain things go in order for the new in order to invest more in the new. So we're very aware that we have to do multiple things at the same time as the NSCF. We have to continue focusing on collections care whilst accelerating digitization, whilst accelerating publication, whilst tracking value and use, whilst also looking at the role of sampling and some of these other themes that Simon brought in. And how could this eco-cycle maybe help us make sense of the complexity of the work that we all face together? So thank you, Chanel. The questions are in the chat, either that or take a screenshot of the questions on the slide. Colleagues, you're going to be in your groups for the next 20 minutes. You go straight to your tea break. After 20 minutes in your groups, you go straight to your tea break, and we will reconvene at 11. We will see you back in the main Zoom room at 11. Please make sure you introduce yourselves to each other, and happiness for you to, as a family, reconnect since our last forum. Thanks, Chanel.
Thanks, Ilse. So I'm opening the rooms. Enjoy your conversations.